I Hi, I love the chat. By the way, if you can interact with me through the chat, I'll be very very happy. I see names I recognize, wonderful people. I am so happy and so excited to be here with you today. I have to thank Disal for this invitation, and I have to thank CNA for allowing me to do this. Oh, we've got people from Peru. This is wonderful. And Rio Preto, Porto Alegre, Itaperuna. Well, Sandrine, Sandra Stevens, I am really, really happy to be here. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about critical thinking. I'm going to talk about the role of teachers in enhancing, developing, fostering critical thinking in learners, how strategic this is, especially today, how important it is for us to talk about this. And I really hope you enjoy our conversation. I really want this to be a conversation. So if you want to ask questions or share your experience, please feel free to use the chat. Okay, we've got Russia. This is so exciting. Well, without further ado, let me just make sure that before I forget, let me just make sure that I offer a 10% discount in our CELTA at CNA. If you write to us before November 12th, okay, you've got 1 week to write to us and enroll in our CELTA course to get a 10% discount. You can see it up here. So please click on CELTA CNA for further information, or just write to CELTA at cna.com.br. It's a special deal from CNA to all of you. Okay. Let me start by telling you what this is about and why I'm going to talk about critical thinking. The first thing that I urge you to do is not to believe in anything that I say. Okay? Don't simply believe me. I would really like this to be a thought-provoking conversation that will trigger further research, that will trigger further reflection. But please don't simply believe me just for the sake of it. Now, if you disagree with me, right, not believing is different from disbelieving, right? So if you don't agree with me, if you think that what I'm saying is not true, before you double check all the facts, please make sure that you look into facts and figures and theoretical background that is reliable. Okay, please don't accept any kind of information via WhatsApp that will contradict what I say. I am here to be challenged, but I'm here to be challenged through science. I am here to be challenged because research has been carried out. Why do I feel slightly confident to talk about critical thinking, even though as I start talking to you, I already feel like a fraud. Okay, and I really hope that you won't discover throughout this conversation what a big fraud I am. But I feel slightly confident because critical thinking is one of my areas of research. I am currently also a tutor for the master's program of the University of Chichester, and I supervise dissertations on critical thinking. At the moment, I have two master candidates who are being supervised by me, and they are both writing about critical thinking. I've written articles about critical thinking. So this is why I feel that I can attempt to talk about this, but under no circumstance should you believe everything I say without questioning, because this is the whole point of this conversation. It's how important it is for us not to immediately believe everything we say as teachers, but also double check and check the facts in reliable, solid material and resources and theoretical background, so that we can later pass this skill, this competence on to our learners. So why is this so important for us to talk about being an English teacher and being a critical agent of change? Well, first of all, because we are living times of horror. We are living times of a very serious frustration from educators, I would say. I don't know if you all have similar experiences. There are people from so many different places. The diversity in this group is beautiful. So I don't know if you agree with me, but in my perspective, it can be very frustrating to be an educator in 2020, 2021, when WhatsApp or, for example, Google have taken over, right? We have been fighting against Google, and trying to show the world that we are still relevant, that you don't simply learn a language because you've Googled it. You don't simply find the answers to your problems because it's on Google, because it's on Facebook, because it's, on the internet. But it is one thing to be aware of this challenge, right? And it is another thing to accept it. We cannot accept it. We, as teachers, have the responsibility, the social responsibility, to raise awareness of the fact that Google is not a teacher. We need to help our students understand that there is much, much, much more beyond the shallow facts that we can very easily access. As a recent philosopher said, Abraham Lincoln, just because you see something on the internet with a quote, a picture, and a date, it doesn't mean it's true. Thank you, Lincoln. He's a friend of mine. We had coffee yesterday, and he allowed me to use this quote. Um, but this is a fact, right? And some years ago, Google was our biggest problem, I think. But nowadays, we see all of this horrible, horrible reality all over the social media and the apps, and our phones and our computers and our small groups. People get memes, and they get pictures with a beautiful line and a quote, or a certain picture, and they immediately believe it. And it's getting criminal. It's a criminal thing that is happening in the world today, because we are not talking about quotes that are harmless, like this one, for example. We are talking about quotes. We're talking about people that are spreading information related to the dangers of vaccination, for example, that the earth is flat, that certain groups deserve to die because of this or because of that. And we cannot just sit still and expect our learners in our classroom not to challenge, not to question this information that is getting to them. It's an urgent matter. It is vital that we become more effective in developing critical thinking. And I'm sorry to be so blunt with you, but I think that we've been failing. We've been failing as educators. The educational systems have been failing, because if we had developed critical thinking successfully in our learners, we wouldn't be going through the chaos and the mayhem and the hell that we're going through today. We would have a generation that would be much more critical and wouldn't be satisfied with a simple meme like this one, believing in whatever is convenient, right? Because that's what we usually believe in. So the dangers of fake news, the dangers of a lack of critical thinking are huge at the moment. They're criminal, as I said. Just to give you an example, I saw that there are people from all over the world, which is really, really exciting. We've got Bulgaria, we've got Russia, and Mexico. I'm going to use an example here in Brazil, right? This is a podcast from America's Quarterly. I don't know if you have read America's Quarterly. If you haven't, I highly recommend you do. It is an award winning publication. They also have a podcast. It is a very reliable source of information, right? We need to start selecting our sources more consciously. This publication has been talking lately, I mean, this is very recent, this is from October the 28th, has been talking about the dangers of fake news all around, right? And they've raised the issue of fake news, Brazil, and our president, our current president, Jair Bolsonaro. And in this very interesting podcast, they explain why misinformation poses a major risk to Brazil's presidential election, and they talk about this with a fact checker. One of the problems with fact checkers is that people who go to fact checkers are usually the people who are more critical. So just recently I read an article about why the fact checking websites or fact checkers hadn't been able to positively impact what is going on a little bit more. And the reason is very simple. The people who are not checking their facts won't go to fact checking websites, won't believe the fact checkers. So, we as educators, we as teachers have the responsibility to develop competencies that go beyond the language and help our learners understand that there is fake news and that there are serious risks if we just believe fake news blindly. One of the challenges that we face is the fact that very few institutions and very few um, locations or organizations or even professionals follow what H. Douglas Brown mentioned as being important back in 2004. H. Douglas Brown said that the objectives of a curriculum are not limited to linguistic factors alone. They should also include developing the art of critical thinking. This was back in 2004. And why is this quote so relevant in the context that I've had the opportunity to experience and to witness? Mainly because English teachers are usually treated, and sometimes they perceive themselves as mere simple linguistic technicians. Our major role is to teach the present perfect and the prepositions of place. And I've heard a lot of teachers say that the classroom, the language classroom, is not a place for debates, discussions, opinions, or things that are more sensitive. I remember I had a coordinator a long time ago that prohibited me. She was giving me advice, right? She said, Vinny, never bring issues that are sensitive to your lessons because we never know how students are going to react. So stick to vanilla, stick to what is simple, right? And just make sure that you talk about the weather or what people are going to order in a restaurant, but don't even ask them what they prefer to eat or why, because this could generate some kind of argument, some kind of conflict, and we don't want that to happen. Well, as it turns out, if you are Brazilian, you probably know that there are three things that we should never discuss in Brazil, right? We should never discuss football, we should never discuss religion, and we should never discuss politics. This is probably one of the biggest disservices that we have permeating our society. Because the moment that we are trained not to talk about these things, and these things are forbidden as social topics, we don't develop the skills to agree and disagree in issues that are essential, that are core in what we do. People disagree because of football to an extent in which they actually kill each other. They get physical. I'm not even going to start talking about religion or politics. So, one of the problems with prohibiting people to talk about certain things, and that goes to society and that goes to our classroom as well, is the fact that we don't develop the competencies and the skills to carry out civilized, respectful, calm conversations about different opinions. And here I'm talking about opinions. And as you probably know, and you're probably fully aware of that, people have been using the word opinion wrongly. People have been stating that they want freedom of speech to express their opinions, when in fact what they are communicating, what they are proliferating, is hate speech, is sometimes criminal comments, or sometimes things that are, scientifically wrong. This is part of our curriculum, helping learners understand that what opinions are, helping learners understand how they can communicate their opinions politely, respectfully, and how they can agree and disagree, not about the fictitious world of should we have cats or dogs at home, right? Because that's what sometimes the course books or the topics flirt with, right? So let's teach students how to agree or disagree. So I like cats and you like dogs. And then, do we really develop the ability and the competence to talk about what really matters in a polite, respectful, mature, scientific, factual manner? If we're simply talking about the cats and the beautiful dogs, I happen to love both, so I would probably be a real flop in this discussion anyway. But what I want to uh, uh, provoke you a little bit into thinking is whether we are afraid of facing this kind of conflict in class, or maybe we're not so prepared to deal with the skills that are necessary for these conversations to be carried out. And as a consequence, we witness a snowball process, because we turn a blind eye to important issues, to burning issues. We keep them in the closet, and then they just, bottle up, and eventually they explode just like a volcano, right? I lost track a little bit of the chat, and I see that people they agree overall. Wonderful. Okay. Yes, yes, everyone. Um, so H. Douglas Brown is not the only one who talks about this. Even before H. Douglas Brown, in 1987, Brookfield was already talking about the importance of critical thinking. And he said that when we think critically about a given topic, we are forced to consider our own relationship to it and how we personally fit into the context of the issue. Thinking critically is being able to relate your own experience, your own biases, your own preconceived ideas, your priorities, your needs, and the topic that you are confronting. It is a very difficult thing to do. There is plenty of research, and if you're interested, I can send it to you, or you can just Google it, because Google is a great tool as long as you know what you're Googling for and which sources you're going to consider. But if you want to Google it, there is plenty of research that shows that there is a very, very, very small percentage of people who can actually think critically. And as teachers, we're being asked to develop critical thinking as a 21st century skill, when in fact many teachers don't have the skill themselves. So we are being asked, and I'm sorry if this is controversial, but we are being asked to develop something that we lack. And the first step, I think, towards having critical thinking is to maybe accept that we are not great critical thinkers ourselves, because being a critical thinker is a very, very complex problem, right? It's a very complex skill. Let me show you what Ennis describes as a critical thinker, right? This is from 1987, and I find it still very relevant. According to Ennis, critical thinkers are open minded and full of alternatives. I like to think that I'm open minded. I like to think that I'm full of alternatives. But every now and then, I am confronted with reality and I realize that maybe my mind is not that open. I'll give you a simple example. I used to go to the supermarket to buy soap, right, to wash my clothes. And I would always buy the same brand. One day, I went to the supermarket with a friend of mine who asked me, "Why are you buying this brand? It's so expensive." And my answer, my very critical answer, was because this is the soap that my mother used to buy. That at that moment I realized how little critical thinking I was dispensing to a fairly, simple, superficial activity, let alone harder things, right? If I can't even choose my soap critically, what how many other things am I doing without thinking? And my friend made me realize that there were other soaps that were not that expensive and were from the same maker. I'm sorry, from the same make, who would do the same job. Um, and I, just realized that maybe I'm not that open-minded, and I don't have as many alternatives as I would like to believe. Right? A critical thinker attempts to be well informed. I love the choice of verb here, to attempt, because being well informed, and especially today with the amount of information and the speed of history, is impossible. You can't. If somebody tells me I am well informed, I already have reservations, because being well informed is really, really, really difficult. We can try, and for you to be well informed, you need to check the same piece of information, the same fact, in many, many different sources. For you to have a solid opinion about anything, you need to hear, or you need to read how different media will talk about it, so that you can say that you are well informed, right? Um, Also, a critical thinker judges well the credibility of sources. And here, my friends, nowadays, everything is considered a source. Wikipedia is a source, Facebook is a source. And, I can't already tell if somebody's a critical thinker or not. The moment they say, "Oh, I read this on blah blah blah, and I think it's true. I received this through my WhatsApp, and I didn't check it anywhere, and I believe it because it's something that I want to believe in." You're not a critical thinker. I'm sorry. And I have already myself, I have already overlooked this a couple of times. I have already believed something without necessarily checking in depth what the source is. A critical thinker also identifies conclusions, reasons, and assumptions. And a critical thinker knows that they are different. You have conclusions, you have reasons, and you have assumptions. A lot of assumptions are turned into reasons or conclusions. You're just assuming things. For you to draw a conclusion, you need to successfully and effectively combine scientific theoretical background with your own meandering experience. It is not just something that you would like to believe in, or something that you would like to be true, that will turn it into a conclusion. This is just an assumption, right? Um, Also, critical thinkers judge the quality of an argument, right? They assess if what other people are saying is a reason, an assumption, and they look for evidence. They want evidence. They consider an argument to have quality when this argument is filled with evidence. And, I just saw Jose quoting, or raising one of the most, I think, one of the most horrible, irresponsible, dreadful fake news that we've been victims of, when the president connected the vaccination against a virus that has killed 600,000 people in our country alone with one of the most painful, terrible viruses of all times, right? And he did it with no evidence, just by saying, "I've read it somewhere, there is some research," and people, just immediately believed it. um, it's we need to have we need to make our students think more critically, and to immediately doubt things that have no evidence. We also want them to develop and defend a reasonable position. Here is, going back to what I said before, here is the ability to talk about difficult things, and to listen attentively and respectfully defend your position, as somebody else is given the opportunity to defend their own position as well. A critical thinker can ask clarifying questions effectively, and as a consequence, with all this in their hands, formulate plausible hypotheses. They are able to hypothesize, they don't depend on other people's hypotheses. They can also experiment and plan these experiments well and define terms in a way that is appropriate for the context. And finally, draw conclusions when warranted. Being a critical thinker is an extremely complex thing. It is not easy. And I think that the more confident we are that we are full-fledged critical thinkers, the less critical we are. So I always pose the question, and I pose this question to myself: Are we critical thinkers ourselves? How easy, how difficult is it to foster a skill, a competence in learners if we are still struggling to develop our own critical thoughts, our own reasoning, our own ability to tell facts from lies, to identify fake news. Um, if we are struggling with this, right? And why is it that we are struggling with this? There's a reason. There are reasons actually. I'm just going to share with you three different ideas from cognitive psychology that try to justify a little bit why we fall prey to little traps, and sometimes we don't think as critically as we would like to. One of them is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? The Dunning-Kruger effect is a fascinating effect that impacts all of us. All of us. Basically, it's when incompetent people are too incompetent to realize that they are incompetent, right? It's the opposite of the more I know, the less I know. The more I realize that I know very little, right? Which is a maxim in philosophy. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the complete opposite. It is like I am so incompetent that I am incompetent to know that I'm incompetent, and this goes to everyone. It's not a characteristic. It's not a syndrome. It's not like, oh, this person suffers from this. No, we have moments of this. And the interesting thing behind the theory of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that many times people who are very successful and knowledgeable in certain areas, they tend to be extremely incompetent in other areas. But because they are successful in one thing that they do, they just assume that they know everything about everything. I'll tell you a little story if you allow me. You know those Sunday lunches when the family gathers together? I was having one of those family lunches, and my uncle, we all have that uncle, right? My uncle, who is an engineer and who is a little bit of, Mr. Know It All, decided to preach about what my cousin's husband should do in order to learn English. Mind you, I was sitting at the table. This was a couple of years ago. I was already a teacher trainer, a published author, and I just quietly listened to his speech, his testimony about what my cousin's uncle should be doing to really learn English. And there was so much crap. It was so crazy. It was just like so. I was just sitting there in awe. I was like, how can you be so incompetent and at the same time so confident, right? And he just went on and on and on. And when he finished talking, and the funny thing, attention, please, I want to emphasize this. My cousin's husband was taking notes, mental notes, but he was really listening attentively. Why? Because his father in law is a successful engineer. So that gives him the title also of, uh, a successful English language expert. And, he just listened and believed everything my uncle said. After his speech, I just raised my hand and I said, "Can I say something? This is, not necessarily true. This is not how it goes." As a matter of fact, if you want to really learn a language, you should do this and that. And then my uncle turned to me and completely disqualified me by saying, "Oh yeah, yeah, this is what people say, but what I know is what is really true, and this is what I'm saying. This is what the schools want you to believe in, but the advice that I'm giving here is the real advice." This is an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? He's so incompetent in this particular field that he's not even embarrassed to say that he doesn't that to say that he knows everything. And we all do this a little bit, okay? Every now and then we are all victims of this effect. Sometimes when we are talking about economy and we think that we know more than somebody who actually studied economy or medicine, or there are so many instances in which we assume that we know more because we experienced something or we heard something, and sometimes we discredit the real professionals. But I don't think there is a profession that suffers more from this than us English teachers, right? Because everybody has an opinion about English language teaching. But the Dunning-Kruger effect is not the only explanation why sometimes we struggle to be critical thinkers. We also struggle because of these other two concepts from cognitive psychology: my side bias and the illusion of explanatory depth. My side bias, I don't know if anybody has heard of this before, and I want to thank everybody who's writing on the chat. I'm trying to follow. There are so many fascinating comments, and this shows me that there are actually people on the other side. So thank you so much. I wish I could see all your faces. That would be even more fun. But the fact that you're writing, it warms my heart. So thank you very, very much. Um, but anyway, my side bias, going back to this, why is it so hard sometimes for us to be critical thinkers? Well, basically because everything that we hear we tend to translate into something that we want to hear. How's that? Well, I'll give you a little example with an experiment that was run to show how my side bias can impact our perception of the world. Two groups of people were put together, right? One group was completely against abortion. There were actually several experiments. In one of the experiments, they were against abortion. There was another experiment in which they were against capital punishment. But let's look at this one first: abortion. One group was against abortion, the other group was for abortion, right? And then what happened? you they received the scientists, right? They gave these two groups some facts and some figures about abortion. They provided a lot of information to these groups, the exact same information. The groups got together to analyze the information, and they had to reassess their opinion. So they had to consider some facts, some figures, and they had to discuss whether they were still against abortion or whether they were still for abortion. When these groups were brought back after their analysis and discussion, do you know what happened? They read the facts and the figures the way they wanted to. The people who were for abortion defended abortion even more, using arguments from the readings, from the research. The people who were against abortion were even more against abortion, and they referred to the same research to justify why they were against it. So, as it turns out, when we read something, when we look for information, we tend to filter this information to privilege our side bias. We are all filled with biases. The first step that we need to take towards critical thinking is to open our hearts and accept that we are all filled with preconceived ideas. We are all biased. We look at people and we make immediate judgment. We hear things and we already have an opinion. And when we read about these things, We look for the information that will corroborate, that will reinforce that opinion. Changing one's mind is almost impossible. It's one of the hardest things to find. It is really difficult to find people who say, I changed my mind about a certain topic. And the more relevant the topic is, the more difficult it is for people to simply change their minds. And sometimes, you can share as much information as you wish. They are going to read it so that it corroborates their side, their bias. The illusion of explanatory depth is very aligned with the Dunning-Kruger effect. The illusion of explanatory depth is when we think we can explain something, but it is something that is much deeper. For example, inflation, right? Everybody has an opinion about inflation. But when asked, can you really explain how inflation works? Can you please, define the system? Many times we realize that we don't really know what it is. I'll give you another more concrete, mundane example. How does a refrigerator work? Or how does a cell phone work? We don't even think about it. We think we know how it works exactly. But when we have to scientifically explain, we realize that it was just an illusion. We live the illusion of explanatory depth, thinking that we are much deeper than we really are. And a lot of times we lack the knowledge that we assume we have. I'll give you here three examples of how this might affect our teaching and how we as teachers sometimes are not as critical as we would like to believe. All of these three examples I found when observing lessons. Observed three different lessons on very different occasions that brought fake news, that brought wrong information to class. These are the three stories. And if you are curious, I don't know if you remember any of these stories. They were very famous on Facebook a while ago. The Derbyshire Ferry was the story of I don't know, a group of people or explorer. I don't know. Somebody found the carbonized body of a fairy. Um, and the funny thing is that they immediately, my side bias, they immediately confirmed the idea that fairies exist. Then a website was created with the pictures of the fairy, and a fundraising started, a fundraising event. So people started donating to the organization that was going to look for fairies. A couple of days or weeks later, the real owner of the ferry realized that things were completely out of control. And he came out and he said, he told the world what he had done. He worked with movies, and he just created that as a Halloween joke, and he left it somewhere as part of a Halloween prank. But as it turns out, people didn't really question it, and I saw one teacher bring this to class to show students how fairies really exist based on the story that had already been um, identified as not true. The second one was a YouTube video that a teacher shared with students, and this one I had to interrupt because it was a group of teenagers, and I just imagined what it was going to be like if teenagers went home and tried to charge an iPod using an onion, and the parents would then complain, and iPhones would be broken or whatever. But if you Google it and if you go to YouTube, you're going to find a lot of videos. The fact that something is said many, many times doesn't make it true. There are hundreds of videos that will teach you how to charge an iPod using an onion, right? Um, and the teacher was naively, it was a very innocent thing, was showing the video to students and kind of like inviting students to try it out. But as it turns out, this is not true. And Hercules, the giant dog, pretty much the same thing. A news article from a newspaper that doesn't exist was brought to class for students to discuss because it was an interesting story, but it was also a lie. These are dramatic stories, okay? These are extreme examples. But as it turns out, we also bring to class sometimes information without checking. And easier the access is, the more access we have to websites and articles and videos, the more interesting it is for us to bring something new to class, something interesting, something current, without checking to see if it is true or not. We are not just language technicians, we are educators. It is our responsibility to check whether what we're bringing to class is true, is a solid fact, is scientific, is proved, or to help our students develop this. If you are going to bring something like this to class, teach your students to find out that it's not true. Teach your students to find out that it's fake news. So bring the video and get your students thinking. Do you think this is true? Do you think, how would you find out? How can you find out whether this is reliable or not? A little bit of media literacy, right? Which is a key concept in critical thinking as well. How can we make our students more media literate, selecting, criticizing, challenging, checking the sources, identifying what is fake, and so on, so forth, right? Because these irresponsible acts, I'd like to believe they didn't really cause a lot of damage, but there are certain things that will cause damage. And one of the things that we are living today is the fact that some teachers feel empowered to start anti-vaccination campaigns, for example. This is extremely, extremely irresponsible, and it's not just a matter of opinion. It is not just a matter of this is what I think, my body, my rules. It is a matter of a scientifically, historically proved issue. And sometimes, these teachers with these opinions that are not based on anything but, their own bias, will face serious consequences not to damage more people. This is an article from the Los Angeles Times from a couple of days ago, in which the journalist explains how teachers who stuck to their anti-vax beliefs are now out of jobs. I personally think that this is the responsible thing to do, because if you cannot identify that an anti-vaccination movement is not a matter of opinion, is not being a critical thinker. It's quite the opposite. With all due respect, it's being extremely ignorant. And you bring this to class, not only are you posing a health risk to your community, you are posing a cognitive risk to all the generations that you're going to teach. Because if you are so incompetent that you cannot even tell what is fake news, what is scientific, then you shouldn't be teaching in the first place. You should be doing something else, something that is, doesn't is not so serious, and it's not doesn't have so much responsibility, right? So this is something that we cannot turn a blind eye to. Um, but how can we bring this to class? Let's try to narrow it down a little bit, right? King and Taba, and this is really, I mean, Taba is from 1966. In 1966, this was already a topic. They argue that the level of students' thinking is strongly influenced by the level of questions which are asked in class. We are not trained to ask questions. We are trained to ask clarifying questions, concept check questions, instruction check questions, but they're all check, check, check. Or, the social questions like, how are you? We are not trained, and I am a teacher trainer. My bad, my bad. Here, a little bit of, self critique. I, you know, I don't think I've been successfully helping teachers develop this skill as a teacher educator. I think that there is a long way to go. I think that as teacher educators, if anybody here is a coordinator, a school owner, a teacher trainer, we need to start fostering the skill of asking questions, high level questions, right? Higher order thinking skills questions, questions that will get students to think deeply think about something, to feel intrigued, to feel confused, to challenge their beliefs. The level of questions that are asked in class needs to be higher. In most classes I observe, and in a lot of the classes that I've taught myself, questions are usually very superficial. They are usually very mechanical and operational questions. They're not necessarily cognitive, challenging questions, right? Um, and uh, why do we need to do this? Because uh, times are asking for this. Times are asking us, to pull up our socks and to go up and fight, right? From flat Earth to climate change denial, kids are deluged with fake science. They're being bombarded with fake news and fake science and fake facts. Teachers need to fight back. In some places, teachers are already fighting back. It is high time we mobilized all the teachers we know. It is high time we developed the confidence and the courage and the responsibility to go out there and fight the fake science and take these people out of the power. We need to just we need to get this over and done with. We're not going to. I think that we will never be able to fully exterminate fake science or fake news or people who are just mean and bad. But we have a social responsibility to try a little harder. And I think that if we get together and we work as a community, we can be stronger and we can start implementing small things in our classes that will be brave enough to foster these skills and critical thinking in the future generations. One way to do it is to consider how we plan our lessons. And I'm going to, you've probably heard of the, Bloom's taxonomy. This is Anderson's revised version, right? Bloom created the taxonomy, Anderson revised it. I like Anderson's version a little better. But one way to do it is to consider how the activities that we propose in class are organized in the taxonomy. I will assure you that most of the time we are at the bottom of the pyramid. We are proposing activities that foster lower order thinking skills. What kind of activities? We usually encourage students to remember, recall information, list things, repeat certain things. If we move a little higher, we might get students to explain, to classify, to recognize, to report. But we need to push forward. We need to have moments in class for students to demonstrate, to illustrate, to operate, to compare, to contrast, to examine, to experiment, to question, to criticize, to test, so that ultimately we can get to create and evaluate the top of the pyramid, real higher order thinking skills, and hopefully get students to evaluate, appraise, argue, judge, select, support, and finally construct new knowledge, construct new things, design, develop, create, formulate, become authors, and not just people who blindly reproduce what they receive, but people who are actually producing content that is worth reading, that is worth accessing, that is worth learning. If we look at our lesson plans and we consider the activities that we have, try to analyze them from this perspective. What am I asking my students to do? And here I already tell you, you are probably going to realize that 80% of what we are encouraged to do by course books, by teacher training courses, is to get students to remember the language, maybe to understand, sometimes to apply. But rarely do we get students to analyze not only the language, but the context, the situation, the opinions, the ideas. Because when we move forward, when we move to the top of the pyramid, we are no longer talking about the language itself. We're talking about life. We're talking about relationships, ideas, thoughts. We're getting students to analyze not the present perfect. Oh, analyze this sentence. This is not critical thinking. We're getting students to compare and contrast opinions, compare and contrast articles, points of view, discourse management. We're talking about much more complex features of communication and not just the mechanics of the language. Um, and a second suggestion that I'm going to actually, it's not a suggestion, but it's the final purpose, right, of implementing Bloom's taxonomy in the way we plan our lessons is to get to the five main pillars of critical thinking. What are these main pillars? It's to question critically, to challenge assumptions, to identify evidence, to identify perspective, because everybody says something from their own place, from their own position, based on their own biases, and to create solutions. These are the five pillars that we want to bring to our classes. By devising a lesson plan that considers Bloom's taxonomy as a basis to this, we can get students to question more critically, to challenge assumptions, to identify evidence, to identify perspective, and to create solutions. And if don't know where to start, if you want more ideas, I'm going to recommend a website that some of you might be familiar with, um, which is called the Project Zero website, right? It's from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Project Zero is a fascinating project that was created in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. No, even before that. But, it has a lot of goals. And one of the most important goals is to get students to think better. They have what they call a thinking routine toolbox with a lot of activities and ideas. They also have professional development courses. They have projects that you can implement. They have forums. Does anybody here know or use Project Zero? Alex said that no for the first time. Good, wonderful. I love to bring new ideas. Oh, great, wonderful. So hopefully something that you can visit and explore. I love Project Zero, and there is so much on the website. So if you go to their websites, please make sure that you allocate plenty of time because it is just fascinating. They have resources for teachers. They have links to forums, and they offer courses as well. And they are always updating what they do. And it's Harvard, baby. So you don't need to worry about the credibility or if it's sound and if it's correct, if it's Harvard. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't challenge or question that, but sometimes people get credentials and they get a certain status and respect for a reason, right? So this is my suggestion here today. 1967, yes, Liz, thank you. It really took off in the 90s, but 1967 it was created. Thank you so much. Um, and before I finish, what I want us to think about is how are we developing ourselves? Because if we want critical thinking to be fostered, we need to look at ourselves. We need to consider how we can be more critical thinkers, how we can be more critical of ourselves and how we are learning and how we're developing. I see a lot of teachers looking for recipes. I see a lot of teachers following on Instagram and Facebook people who promise easy fixes and easy recipes, and these are the same teachers that get really furious when a YouTuber whose names I'm not going to use, but certain YouTubers promise that you can learn English in 2 months or promise that you can learn English without any effort. This teacher gets really upset when somebody is trying to simplify or undermine the complexity of their job. The same teacher goes to a teacher trainer, goes to an author goes to a coach or whatever you want to call them and asks for a recipe, an easy fix, something that will be effortless, something that will be easy to implement, a solution, a miracle. And then, I find this extremely uh, ironic, right? I find it very hard to believe because, and this shows how in different perspectives we're different people. We feel offended when somebody's doing our job and making promises that are impossible to sustain. But at the same time, when we are in the other position, we want the same promises and we want the same miracles. So what I want us to consider is, if we want critical thinkers to blossom in our language classrooms, and this is not a quote from anybody else, these are my opinions, this is what I am saying. So if you don't agree with that, you don't agree with me, and that's absolutely fine. Please build a case and prove me wrong. But if we want critical thinkers to blossom in our language classroom, we first need to revisit how we develop as teachers, our training frameworks, our educational processes. We need to look at ourselves. Critical thinking needs to be an integral part of professional development. And teacher trainers, teacher educators have to constantly reflect upon their role in turning teachers into more critical professionals. And teachers should do the same to themselves. Because then we are able to make well informed decisions, explain why these decisions are made, and develop this same knowledge, this same skill, this same competence in our language learners. This is a little bit of what I wanted to share with you. If you want to stay in touch, my Instagram is Vinnie_Nobre. I am putting it in the chat. And we still have 5 minutes. If anybody has a question, please feel free to ask. Um, and remember that we have this special deal until November the 12th, 10% off in a CELTA course at CNA. The CELTA course fosters critical thinking. It is built to provoke you and to make you feel uncomfortable and to stabilize you in a positive way. So please, please, please consider this. These are some of the references that I used. If anybody is interested, okay. The best way to reach me is through Instagram. I'm going to put it here. Somebody asked for my email. It's easier to find me on Instagram. Um, and I guess this is a little bit of what I wanted to share with you. I love teaching. I love education. I feel very frustrated with the way things are going nowadays, but I try to turn this frustration and this disappointment into fuel, into the energy that I need to become a more relevant practitioner, to become a more relevant educator, so that the future generations don't have to fight anti-vaccination tribes, or don't have to be bombarded with fake science that doesn't really cause us any good. So if I can make my contribution, and you're here today, hope that this has been a contribution somehow to your professional development. If I can make my contribution to make this a better place, a safer place, a more respectful place, then this is the legacy that I want to leave behind. This is the person that I want to be in the world. So thank you very much for allowing me to try and be that person. Thank you very much for your time. Love you all. Miss a lot of you who I know. And I hope I can see you soon. Thank you. I'll take a look at the questions, but please feel free to leave, okay? Thank you so much, everyone.